Richard had the same dream again. It was strange and extremely distressing. It always began the same way as well. Richard was walking alone on a sunlit path leading towards the Forest Park area. The place seemed familiar because the city cemetery lay just beyond it. His wife and daughter found their final resting place there. Trapped in the realm of Morpheus, Richard followed the path until it led him to an alley with even rows of graves on both sides. And that was when the worst part usually began. Trying to find the graves of Evelyn and Sally, Richard moved from place to place, unable to distinguish one burial from another. It seemed to him that he had lost his way and was now condemned to eternal searching for the plot where his loved ones were buried. Tears streamed down Richard's face as he knelt before the graves, trying to make out what was written on the plaques. But the dream had its own rules and seemed to intentionally lead Richard away from where his closest people were buried. The feeling of profound despair and desperation became so acute that within a couple of minutes, Richard woke up with a loud cry, waving his arms in all directions and shouting something unintelligible. Of course, there was no cemetery to be found. He was in his bedroom, trying to sleep amid the quiet sounds of a working TV. Well, there you go again, some rest that was. And now I won't be able to fall asleep again, the man whispered, heading to the kitchen to have some coffee. Not a day passed without Richard remembering the fateful accident that took the lives of the people dearest to him. The car that veered into the oncoming lane, Evelyn's screams as she tried to avoid the collision. And then a powerful impact that put an end to that dreadful incident. Richard had learned all about it from the first responders who arrived at the scene. So much sorrow was endured, so many tears were shed. But there was no point in talking about it anymore. A year had already passed, but it felt like it was just yesterday. Since then, Richard had this distressing dream almost every night, where a faint path led him towards the cemetery. Why does this scene keep haunting my dreams, with the cemetery and the path leading to it? He wondered upon waking up in cold sweat. The grief of losing his loved ones was so immense that Richard couldn't think of anyone or anything else. His beautiful wife Evelyn and little Sally. Looking at their family photos, Richard couldn't hold back his tears. Why was God so cruel to him? Why didn't he protect his family from this kind of suffering? But no one could answer that question for him. Since Richard had the same troubling dream that night too, he woke up feeling broken and exhausted. Having taken a quick shower, he had a cup of strong coffee and started getting ready for work. Despite all of his hardships and pain, life didn't stand still. And Richard understood that better than anyone else. Richard stepped out of the house, and as he was about to get into his car, he spotted his neighbor, Mrs. Goodman. The elderly woman was sitting on a bench with a meek expression on her face. "Good morning. Where are you off to so early in the morning, Mrs. Goodman?" Richard inquired. The old lady smiled shyly. "Well, I'm going to the house of worship, Richie. There are some questions I want to find answers to, and it wouldn't hurt to talk to my religious leaders about it." Richard nodded mechanically and got behind the wheel of his Ford. At that moment, a thought pierced his mind. That's what I need. Religion. Why didn't I think of that sooner? He knew that in situations like this, it was often the house of God that could provide adequate answers to questions related to the loss of loved ones. Having decided not to put it off for a long time, Richard could barely wait to get off work and head to the house of God. The head of the house of worship welcomed him warmly and only asked very few questions initially. Richard hadn't been to the house of God in over 10 years, so he couldn't help but feel rather awkward at first. But as he got more comfortable, he shared everything that had accumulated in his soul over the past few months. Alfred Brown was an older man who had been serving at this house of God for many decades. Thus, having heard what Richard had to say, he asked a simple question. "Are there symbols on the graves of your loved ones?" Richard immediately became flustered and looked away. That whole situation with the funeral and all the subsequent memorial events had completely thrown him off balance. But Mr. Brown was right. There were no symbols on their graves, nor did they have memorable gravestones. Just some brass plaques engraved with their information and nothing more. Having shared this information with the leader, Richard immediately saw understanding in his eyes. That must be it. The world isn't as simple as it seems. As for the dreams, Sometimes the souls of the departed communicate with us this way. Richard's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. The man couldn't help but feel that the elderly leader was very wise. Richard was very impressed at how he almost immediately pointed him in the direction of a solution to his problem. The next day, Richard went to the funeral home to order tombstones in the shape of symbols for Evelyn and Sally. Having carefully listened to the customer, the man presented several options for Richard to choose from. "All right, sir, we'll make the tombstones. You'll have to wait for a couple of days, though. And we need you to pay up front, please," the man said. Richard nodded and reached into his pocket to get his wallet. His heart was singing. A feeling of lightness and comfort filled his soul, which had been tormented by the loss of his loved ones. Richard knew that he'd made the right decision because as soon as he ordered the tombstones, he stopped having dreams about the path leading to the cemetery. Now Richard could sleep peacefully, and his mornings were no longer marred by headaches and anxiety. Nevertheless, Richard preferred not to talk about his discoveries. Matters of personal faith didn't seek public acknowledgement, and according to the leaders, there was a place for God in every person's soul. After this conversation with the leader of the House of God, Richard began to recite a prayer every morning, hoping that a sense of comfort and tranquility would permanently settle in his soul. However, when only 2 days remained until the installation of the tombstones on his daughter and wife's graves, something strange happened. This time, however, it wasn't a dream, but something different, something Richard couldn't find a logical explanation for. That night, he returned home from work as usual and started preparing a simple dinner, consisting of instant noodles and a couple of turkey slices. But as soon as he approached the stove, he distinctively felt someone's attentive gaze upon him. Richard turned his head to the left and barely managed to hold back a surprised gasp. Standing a few feet away from him was Evelyn. Well, not her, of course, but her ghostly projection, which was looking at him with eyes filled with longing and sadness. "Evelyn, what are you doing here?" Richard exclaimed, dropping the fork. Evelyn remained silent for a moment and then spoke in a dry, toneless voice, devoid of any inflection. "Dig up my grave, Richard." The phrase, spoken by his wife, made Richard shudder. He backed away until his back was pressed against the wall, afraid of what might happen next. To his great relief, nothing terrible happened, and the ghostly projection of Evelyn dissolved into thin air, as if it had never been there. Richard wiped the sweat off his forehead and sighed in relief. "Those are some tricks my mind is playing on me." Unfortunately, after what he had witnessed in the kitchen, he had completely lost his appetite. Trying to calm his trembling hands, he turned on the TV, but it displayed nothing but static for some reason. All of this seemed very strange to Richard. No matter how much he tried to calm himself down, he couldn't shake off the feeling that everything that happened to him was extremely irrational. Something was clearly wrong. Richard felt it in his heart. Why is Evelyn so insistent on me going to the cemetery? And why does she want me to dig up her grave? What does it all mean? God, have I completely lost my mind? The man thought. At that moment, Richard remembered the words of the leader, who said that nothing in life happens without reason. What if this was another message from Evelyn? After all, she wouldn't haunt me for no good reason. Richard pondered and glanced out the window. Twilight was rapidly descending over the city, but it couldn't deter him from going to the cemetery. Richard felt that if he didn't fulfill Evelyn's request, he'd lose his sleep for weeks or even months to come. It was already pitch black outside by the time Richard got to the cemetery. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, so the man had to resort to using his flashlight. As he shifted the beam of light from one grave to another, Richard felt an incomparable sense of déjà vu. Basically, everything that happened to him at that moment seemed like nothing else than the dream he'd been seeing many times, in which he fruitlessly searched for the grave he needed. Fortunately, it didn't take him long to find Evelyn's burial. But when Richard got closer, he felt very uncomfortable. Something was clearly wrong with the grave. Clumps of earth were scattered everywhere, and the burial mound itself looked disrupted and uneven, as if someone had recently dug into it with a shovel. Dear God, what's going on? Has someone decided to desecrate Evelyn's grave? Richard exclaimed, lowering himself to his knees. Recalling his late wife's words, he started digging into the burial mound with his hands as if he was a possessed treasure hunter. After digging down about 1.5 feet, Richard felt a solid wooden surface. A coffin, but it can't be this close to the surface. A frantic thought flashed through the man's mind. Richard's fears were confirmed. It really was a coffin, though it was roughly made and lacking the usual attributes like side handles or a polished surface. Well, here's the moment of truth, Richard whispered to himself and removed the lid. What he saw was so shocking that he fell to his knees and closed his eyes in fear. Inside the coffin lay a woman, her pregnant belly noticeably protruding against the rest of her body. "Oh God, she's pregnant," echoed in Richard's mind. However, when he touched the stranger's wrist, he made an equally shocking discovery. The woman's hand was warm, and from the looks of it, she appeared to be merely sleeping. Realizing that there was no time to lose, Richard pulled out his phone and called the police. At first, the officer on duty thought it was a prank or some kind of confession of a mentally disturbed person. But when Richard provided his name and social security number, a police unit was dispatched to the cemetery along with the team of medics from the rescue service. Fortunately, they arrived in time and managed to save the woman. Even more so, when she reached the hospital, she safely gave birth to a baby girl, which everyone saw as nothing short of a miracle. As it turned out later, the story of the double burial had a clear criminal undercurrent. The culprits were after the lonely widow's money. Even the fact that Linda Garcia was pregnant didn't seem to matter to them. Their plan was simple: drug the unfortunate widow and then bury her in any grave without a tombstone at the city cemetery. The reason they chose Evelyn's grave for their scheme remained unknown. Most likely it was purely accidental, but that accident turned out to be a fateful one. The perpetrators were Linda's gardener and maid, who conspired after learning that their employer had come into a substantial inheritance. It was only thanks to the fortunate coincidence that a tragedy could be averted. However, Richard didn't see it that way. He remembered well that his late wife used to work as a pediatrician. He believed that she continued to care for children even after her death, as kiddos had always been her #1 priority in life. Meanwhile, having learned Richard's story, Linda decided to name her newborn daughter Sally in memory of Richard's deceased child. Sometimes the young couple was seen strolling the park, which inevitably gave rise to rumors and speculations about their blossoming romance. But Richard and Linda never paid any attention to it, as they preferred to enjoy the pleasant moments together and cherish life in all its manifestations.